Okay, so we have another official debate, again with Jiva and Footsoldier. For this debate, Jiva's taken the position that deontology and non-theism are incompatible. Footsoldier's taken the opposition. As always, when we be based upon who concedes, we don't get a vocal concession from either participant. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can vote on who you think performed better in the debate. No time limit, no moderation. You guys can get started.
Right. So I guess it's a positive claim. So would you like to establish the reasons why you feel they're incompatible?
Yes. So my view is that the concepts of right and wrong or morality can only be based in theism or spiritual philosophy. Otherwise, it's just an opinion, right? So I think the non-theist only really has three options when it comes to morality, and one is moral nihilism. The second is moral relativism or cultural relativism, and the third is to base their morality in utilitarian ethics. But obviously, obviously there still is a grounding issue with utilitarianism, but at least they can produce a moral code as such. But I just don't see how they can base their morality in deontology when there is no, because the only way that you can, in my opinion, is if you have a moral authority to appeal to. Otherwise, it just boils down to your opinion and it's subjective. So I suppose I'd start with that and get your response on that.
Sure. So I'm a moral objectivist, and I would just point to the categorical imperative, and that's
Mhm.
how I get my objective moral claims for certain moral propositions. Not all moral propositions, but certain moral propositions. So we can have a claim such as you could say to me, foot soldier, I think stealing is okay. Stealing's morally permissible. And I'll say, okay, well let's have a look if that can actually work out. So we'll just take stealing, and what happens if everyone was to steal? If everyone was to steal, then or be okay with stealing and find it morally permissible to steal, there would be no such thing as stealing anymore. You would annihilate the concept of stealing, of theft, and you'd also annihilate the concept of property ownership altogether, because everyone would just be okay with taking shit, and it would not be problematic at all because everyone would be okay with it. So you couldn't steal because there would be no private property ownership in the first place, right?
Can
So
I
you
jump?
just
Can I jump in there to clarify something?
okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't understand what you mean by there would be no theft if that position if everybody stole. I believe there still would be theft.
Um, well, how can there be theft if everyone is okay and finds it morally permissible to steal? You can't find, like, if I've got something on my desk and you walk in and take it, and I'm like, yeah, go ahead, take it, man. It's fine. I don't want this thing.
Hmm.
That's not stealing. That's taking.
Well, that's not my understanding of the categorical imperative, the Kantian categorical imperative. So, for example, if I take £5 from you and you steal £5 from me, we both still committed theft. But I think what Kant is pointing out is that neither of us have benefited. So it was a pointless activity. In fact, we both lost because we've spent our time, effort, and energy stealing from each other, and we've both ended up in the same positions. So nobody benefits, cui bono. Um, so I think that's why he says it's not a desirable outcome. So is still basing his categorical imperatives in outcome, in my opinion. So I do believe that it is still linked to consequentialism. But I mean, do you disagree with me on that interpretation of the Kantian categorical imperative?
Well, the thing is, people often say, "Oh, that's not how Kant does it. He does it in another way." Well, the thing is, there's multiple interpretations. You've got multiple forms of the categorical imperative. There's four main forms, and um, the universalizability principle can also be interpreted in various different ways as well. And I'm not wedded to any specific interpretation or any specific method of arriving at how
Mhm.
you do it if you get the same result either way. So what I see is if there's any type of contradiction or any type of reason why this could not be a universal law, because if we're talking about something being moral and something being immoral, then there would be it would act in the same way everywhere. You can't have something which is you can't have theft being moral in Brisbane, but not in Sydney, it doesn't change geographically the morality of something if it is objectively the case, right? So if we're going to have an objective morality, then it would
Yeah.
be like a universal law. And if we can see that it couldn't possibly work as a universal law, then we know that it could not possibly be morally permissible.
Yeah, well, I think there's a bit of a leap there, which I'll come back to in a moment. But yeah, so the point you would concede though that the point of the Kantian categorical imperative is he's picking activities which, if everybody did them, if they were universalized, then there would be no benefit, right? It would lead to undesirable outcomes. So, for example, if everybody murdered, right, everybody ends up dead, so that's an undesirable outcome. If everybody steals, nobody benefits, right? So that's an undesirable outcome. But he's not actually saying that it's like defeating. Is that your point? Like that it can't happen because I can still steal from you, you can still steal from me. They're still both thefts, aren't they?
No,
It's
the
just
point is you cannot steal from me if you find theft morally permissible. That's the point. So you have given one interpretation, and the thing is, Kant himself doesn't rigidly stick to one principle of the way
Mhm.
that we universalize stuff. Like you can say, you steal £5 and I steal £5, and then we're in the same position, and it was a waste of time. You can say that, but what I would say is, and what I think Kant argues for as well, uh, in other cases, and in the case of theft as well, he argues that you would abolish property ownership, and not only that, but the whole idea of theft would self-defeat, because you can't have something as theft if you're okay with it being taken, because then that's taking and it's not theft. So not only do you end up with a pointless exercise, not only do you self-defeat or annihilate the concept of theft, but um, you also abolish property rights, right?
Mhm.
You've just said, okay, I'm okay with there being no property rights. So there's three ways that I see that theft would not universalize, and
Mhm.
you've picked one. That's fine. I've got another two.
Yeah,
They're all
but that
equally good.
second one, yeah, I mean that second one, Foot Soldier, doesn't make much sense to me because I mean, why would you? I mean, why would you have to be morally? Why would you personally have to be okay with theft in order to commit theft yourself? I mean, there's no reason, is there, for that? You could be a thief and say, I just don't want to be stolen from myself, and you go out stealing, right? Um,
That's just a misunderstanding of what the categorical imperative is getting at, right? It's saying, can can this proposition be universalized as though
mhm,
it was a universal law of nature? So, if everyone did this, if it occurred at all times, is it possible, without introducing some contradiction,
mhm.
that this could happen, right?
Yes, and
And
it is possible because let's say everybody steals £5 from their neighbour, right, and it goes round in a circle. That's possible. It can happen, can't it? And everybody ends up, after the event is finished, everybody ends up with zero gain, right? Everybody's in the same position, but it's happened, hasn't it? Everybody has
no,
stolen £5 from
no,
their neighbour.
no, this is a misunderstanding. If everyone thought that, right, so we come up with a proposition: stealing is morally permissible, and then we universalize it. Everyone thinks that stealing is morally permissible, and they all steal £5 from their neighbor. Well, they can't
Mhm.
steal £5 from their neighbor because stealing is permissible, so their neighbor allows them to take it, and it wasn't theft. Not only
Yeah.
have we ended up in a net non-gain because everyone's got the £5, or someone else's £5, but they've still got
Mhm.
the £5 originally. Not only is that, but also it's self-defeating what theft is, because if everyone says theft is morally permissible, they think that theft is morally permissible, then they can't be stolen from because they find it permissible, and then it's just taking. So it self-defeats in multiple ways. It also self-defeats because you will abolish property ownership entirely,
Mhm.
because if you think that stealing is morally permissible, then you're okay with your stuff being stolen, and then you don't have any claim to have stuff. So then the concept of stealing won't function because you don't have any property ownership. So it
Yeah.
self defeats in different ways depending on your perspective of looking at it. But I don't care about the perspective you take. All it
Yeah.
all it matters, all that matters is that you get to the result, and all three of them lead to the same result, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, I do need to interject there because actually I think I'm not sure it does self-defeat. I think what you're doing is changing the definition of theft or stealing. But also, this is a sort of I see this as a sort of cart before the horse reasoning. You're starting with the proposition that stealing is bad, but I think the point is you're supposed to conclude with that, not start with that premise. And I don't see
no,
how
no,
you
no,
can.
no, no. It's a test, right? The categorical imperative is like a test, and
Okay,
I
deduction.
don't want to be condescending, but it
No. Hello.
can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah,
I've got another.
you cut out. So I didn't catch anything after you said you don't want to be condescending.
Yeah, I just got
Yeah.
a phone call which I had
Okay.
to. It's annoying because on iPhone when you get a phone call, Discord stops and you. I don't think you can even hang up. You just have to either accept it or wait for them to go away.
Okay, well,
But
no problem.
I sent a message. Can't talk about that. But yeah. So the what was I saying? Yeah, I don't want to be condescending, but it feels like you haven't fully understood what the categorical imperative is, right? Because the categorical imperative isn't something whereby it just tells you all of the answers to everything, right? So you need to first give a proposition. You need to first. It's like a test, right? It's that you come up with a proposition, you use the categorical imperative or the universalizability principle to test it, and then you see if it universalizes, and if it doesn't, it fails the test and it can't be morally permissible, right? So this is that's just one of four sort of one of four versions of the categorical imperative. But in the
Mhm.
sense that we're concerned with the first one, we come up with a proposition: stealing is wrong, stealing is. If we come up with stealing is wrong, then we'll see that that's fine. If we want property ownership and we think that is
Mhm.
it universalizes stealing is wrong. Of course that works. But if we say
Mhm.
stealing is morally permissible, then it doesn't universalize for the reasons that we've just discussed, right? So all we're using it for is a test. So
Mhm.
if we say we want to be moral people, we want to do the right thing, and the way that we get to our moral facts, or some of the moral facts, is to test propositions by universalizing them, then what we've done is we have the motivation to act, we have the means to know how to act, and we are able to act in accordance with it.
Mhm.
There is nothing more to the system which we need. We don't need a god. We don't need some supernatural force. There's nothing else that we need other than knowing what the moral facts are, having a process to discover the moral facts, to know what they are, and then acting in accordance with it, and having the desire to act as a moral person. And
Mhm.
you might say, okay, well, what about the desire to act as a moral person? Or do you just ask it, do you want to be a moral person? If the person doesn't want to be a moral person, then they don't have to be a moral person. They can do whatever they want, and then they can be locked up. But that isn't the debate proposition. The debate
Yeah,
proposition
well,
is concerned with,
a moral person by your standards and by Kant's standards, right? We need to
well,
highlight that.
by the standards of the system that they're using. But your
Yeah.
claim by the debate proposition is that deontology is incompatible with non-theism. Now, I've just given you a perfectly coherent account of how I can be a deontologist, and I am a deontologist. I'm a neo-Kantian. I don't
Yeah.
I don't buy whole everything that Kant says, but I
Mhm.
pick and choose the bits that I like and package it up into a system that I think is neat and functional. And then
Mhm.
I use that to get to my understanding of moral facts, objective moral facts, and I act in accordance with that. If you've got
Okay.
some other system, then that's fine. But if it's a deontic system, there's no
Mhm.
reason why you can't be a deontologist in a secular way.
Okay, so I'll respond to those points. Just coming back to the categorical imperative, yes, no, I agree with you about how you test it. You know, you plug in a behavior into the system and you follow it through. It's kind of like a scientific deduction, isn't it? You test what the outcome is and against a prediction. So, yeah, I
Right.
completely accept that point. Um, but the issue is that all of this boils down to it's Immanuel Kant's opinion. I mean, I just don't see how what the grounding is for this still, right? Because like I said, I think you can only be a deontologist if you have a moral authority to appeal to. I could come to Immanuel Kant, I could come to him and say, no, look, I disagree with you. I think, so what if something's self-defeating? That's fine. So what if everybody ends up dead? That's good. So I could say, you know, I don't believe in desirable, quote, desirable outcomes. I believe in undesirable outcomes. I believe it would be better off if all humans were dead. It would be better off for all other species. So I'm asking you, what is your grounding, or what moral authority are you appealing to make deontological claims that there is a right and there is a wrong?
Right. So the question is about grounding, and I think for me, I'm satisfied with having the grounding that if we are to have a meaningful conversation about morality, and if we're going to have even a ballpark understanding of what morality is, then we would, or objective morality at least, and I don't think it makes much sense to say that whatever my opinion is moral. So subjectivism just seems like nonsense to me. I think if there is some matter, some fact of the matter about what is moral and what is not, then
Mhm.
it would have to be something which could possibly function as a universal law of nature. Because if it couldn't function as a universal law of nature, then it couldn't possibly be something objectively moral that you could point to and say that this is the case. Because if it can't work, right, if it's not possible for it to be the case, then it can't be the case. And we can just see, using the universalizability principle, that
Mhm.
certain moral propositions could not possibly be the case if they are to be a universal law of nature. And now you could say, right, well, I don't care about moral propositions having to be like a universal law of nature. I think that moral propositions obtain to my personal whim. Well, then I'm just going to say, well, you've got a different understanding of morality. You've got an understanding of morality that doesn't correspond to what we normally are going to discuss when we use the word morality. In the same way that if we are having a discussion about hands, like my hands and your hands, and I've got 10 fingers, um, and then you start thinking about octopuses, then we have a problem. It's not necessarily the case that you're wrong about what you're thinking about octopuses, but you're simply thinking about something else. So if we are to have a meaningful conversation about morality, then it would be necessarily something which is right and wrong behavior and some fact of the matter that could be possibly a universal law. If it's impossible that it could be a universal law of nature, then that's not something that could possibly be objectively moral in the first place.
Right. Okay. Well, there are a few issues there. So first of all, I would say we do agree on what morality is. Our disagreement is in what constitutes morality. So what is good and what is bad. But we agree on the concept of good and bad, right? But on the second issue, this universalizable principle, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to come back to this again. I still don't see why theft is not, because you're saying it would have, it's something which would contradict itself. It wouldn't be possible as a law. But I don't see why universal theft would be impossible as a law. I think it's perfectly fine. It can happen, universal theft. And my contention is that Kant is arguing theft is not universalizable because it leads to completely undesirable outcomes for everybody. So I believe he's actually basing his argument in consequentialism, like a little, a little sneakily in a way. But I don't see how it couldn't become a universal law. Like I said, if theft is defined as the act of taking someone's property from them without their permission, I still don't see why everybody can't do that. I don't see how it self defeats. I don't see how it. Um,
Right. Well, you've just given yourself the answer. If you think about what you've just said, theft is defined as taking something from someone without their permission. Well, if they find it permissible, right,
but who
then you
said
have
who
their
said they
permission.
find it permissible? Yeah, but you're
Because
saying
if
they
we
find it permissible.
universalize the proposition, then they must find it permissible if we're to universalize the proposition hypothetically. That's the whole point of the universalizability principle. That's what we do. That is, I think, I don't want to be mean, but I think you've just misunderstood what
Okay.
Kant is doing there. That's the whole point, right? So if we say we get a proposition such as stealing is morally permissible, and we universalize it so everyone thinks that stealing is morally permissible, then no one can be stolen from because they find it permissible for people to take shit with, like, but how can you take shit? There's the contradiction. Stealing is taking without their permission. You've given permission, but you've been stolen from because they've taken without your permission, but you've given your permission. So you haven't given your permission. So then it's a contradiction. It can't possibly universalize because you get a contradiction. That's the whole point of the categorical or the universalizability principle, right? So that's like the classic example. It doesn't matter. Like, there might be some additional argument to be made for if everyone stole and everyone stole back, and then you would end up with the same £5 note or the equivalent amount of money, and everyone's just swapped £5 notes. That's some additional argument you can make, and that's fine. And I think Kant might argue for that as well. I'm pretty sure he does. But that's supplemental to the understanding of the contradiction. The whole point of the universalizability principle is that something cannot possibly be a universal law of nature because it self contradicts. If you can't have gravity self-contradicting. You can't have any law of nature self-contradicting. We don't find that in nature because that's incoherent. That it self-contradicts. You can't have things, gravity pulling up and down at the same time. You can't have water cohering to the act of gravity but not cohering and flying up and down at the same time. We can't have these things in nature. If there was some natural force that we called morality, it could not self-contradict. That's the point. We use the universalizability principle to get to our moral truths, to the moral facts, to understand what could possibly not be permissible. And you could say that there's some additional moral facts that we're unsure about, and they could be based upon descriptivism of some kind under a deontological system. But in the purest essence of knowing the moral truth of some facts, you can quite easily be a deontologist of the most secular kind. So in terms of the debate proposition, I don't see that you've established a case for why I now have to start worshipping God.
Well, no, I didn't say you have to start worshipping God. I'm saying that a moral authority is the only way you can be a deontologist, because that's the only way there can be, moral truths of life. Well, not the only way. Okay, so one could argue there is an objective moral code in nature, right? And it's just something which has come about evolutionarily, right? But the problem
Well,
with
no,
that,
it's not only nomologically the case, it's logically the case. You can't have a possible world that gravity both does and does not pull objects downwards, right? That's not a possible world. That's an impossible world, right? So there's no possible world in which gravity can go both up and down at the same time on the force on an object. So in terms of the coming to the moral facts, I've given you a purely secular account of how I'm a deontologist, and you're saying that it's incoherent. So can you point out where the incoherence is?
yeah. So basically, well, firstly, I think the grounding issue is still there for you, because you haven't made it clear to me how these are objective moral truths. So, for example, you would say theft is wrong. Okay, it's action based, it's intent based. You can just say it's wrong, right, without looking at the consequences. That's the point you're saying. Am I correct?
It's deductively wrong based on the universalizability principle. Yeah.
Right. So, can you give me other examples of acts that would be deductively wrong based on the universalizable principle?
Yeah, sure. So you can just take anything you like and run it through, and like, for example, rape. We could just take rape and be like, well, if um, if rape, let's have the moral proposition, rape is morally permissible, then for the same reasons we universalize it, and everyone finds rape permissible. So then, if you rape someone, it means the act of having unconsensual sex with someone who consents to having sex with them, so they both do and do not consent simultaneously, and that's the contradiction. So it couldn't possibly be the case. So then we have two moral facts, right? We have stealing and we have rape. We can go to other ones as well, but we, even if I just have two, I don't even need to reel off more and more and more of them. Even if I just simply have two facts, I've objectively arrived at two moral facts, multiple moral facts, deductively. And so, if that holds, even if
Well,
I have only two rule-based things, I've still got a rule-based system where I have multiple rules that govern my behaviour. And let's say I only need two. I can introduce another one. I could introduce suicide, for example. I could introduce a whole bunch of things using the Kantian approach. I could.
okay. How would you use suicide?
Suicide is a bit more complex, but you can still argue for it. You can still say, look, if I have a moral duty to act, if I have a moral duty to act morally, right? So I've got a duty to act morally. Then, if I kill myself, then there's no way that I could act. I could be an actor, right? So I'm defeating. So one perspective is that I'm defeating my ability to be a moral actor, and so I cannot. Like my aim is to act morally, and if I kill myself, I cannot act morally. So by choosing to commit suicide, I'm choosing to self-defeat my ability to act morally. But the reason why I'm doing that is because if suicide was to be morally permissible, the moral permissibility and my performing of the suicide would be in order to further my ends to act morally. But in doing so, to further my ends to act morally, I'm defeating my ability to act morally. So I both am acting, I'm both morally acting and not morally acting, right? At the same, it self defeats because you can no longer, because your end of acting morally is self defeated, by ending your your means to act morally. So you both are perpetuating your ends to act morally because you're trying to do what is moral, and you're ending your means to act morally. It's a bit of a long explanation. It's a bit more difficult with the suicide one, but you're simultaneously perpetuating and ending your means to act morally. In a nutshell,
Okay.
it's a bit of a longer one, but we got there.
Yeah, I mean, that's very confusing to me, but there are two issues I still want to raise, or two questions rather. The first would be, okay, so even if I can see that the categorical imperative tells you what not to do, does it tell you what to do? Does it tell you what is moral? And the second issue a question I would ask you is, I still want to come back to the grounding issue. Why is this a moral truth? I mean, why? Now, obviously, Immanuel Kant, he believed in an immortal soul, so he may have had some spiritual, religious reasons for saying why these things are desirable or why these things are right or wrong. But I would like to know that you're a non-theist would argue for the grounding for
Right.
such conclusions.
So two things on the table, and one of them can be very easily taken off. So you're saying that we need positive rights and negative rights. Well, I'll just deny that. We can just have positive rights. I could argue, negative rights. I could argue for positive rights, but I can't be bothered, and that's a separate conversation, and it's not necessary to debate proposition. That would be a tangent. It would be a bit of a red herring because I don't even need to argue for positive rights as long as I have two or more negative rights, meaning do not steal, do not rape, and we can go through a list. As long as I've got
Well,
two
can I
things.
interject there? Because isn't deontology about producing what is good and bad? I mean, can you just say what is bad?
Deontology is a rule, is following rules
Yeah,
in terms of
yeah,
morality. So I'm acting
yeah,
morally by following rules. That's deontology.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
could say
Which
one of my rules.
Mhm.
Is everything, and this is one of my rules. Everything is morally permissible unless it is morally impermissible, right? So Is it morally good or bad for me to pick up a stone? Well, is it morally bad? No, it's not. Is it morally good? I don't know. It's morally
Yeah, so
permissible. It's fine.
that's a false dichotomy you've just presented. So just a quick Google search. I mean, I'll read you the definition, the first definition that comes up. Deontology is a theory that suggests actions are good or bad according to a clear set of rules. Its name comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty, and then so on and so forth, right? Actions that obey these rules are ethical, while actions that are not are not. And obviously, the ethical theory is most closely associated with Immanuel Kant. So again, I think you do still need a description of what is good, and how can you get these prescriptive or normative values of what is good from your framework without a moral authority to appeal to?
But just because you've Googled one definition, right,
Yeah.
that doesn't invalidate all types of deontology which are negative based, right? We do get positive rights using the Kantian model, because if you could not conceive of a world where that you could like the world is horrible in some way, then that could not be morally permissible, even if it doesn't self-contradict. So, and if that is a world where you don't perform a certain action, right, that you neglect to help someone and they die in front of you, right, or something like this, if that's a world that you couldn't possibly live in, then that wouldn't be in line with the categorical imperative, and you would have a positive right, you would have a duty to act in accordance with that. But I don't even need to grant you that. I don't even need to explain that. I don't need to make a case for positive rights. All I need to do is show you that I can objectively arrive at a rule-based system to get at least two or more objective moral facts that I can use to govern my behavior that is morally impermissible behavior. And so I can say that the moral good is acting in accordance with the system, and the moral bad is acting against the system.
Yeah, but your point is, Footsoldier, I agree. You have created a system yourself. I could create my own system myself and say, right, I'm going to make this system for my morality. I'm going to say anything which brings me pleasure is good, anything which brings me pain is bad, and then I'm going to implement that on society. I still need this grounding. I still need to know why you are saying these things are good and why these things are bad. Why is a universalizable principle good and why is a non-universalizable principle bad?
Right. Well, firstly, I've already given you an account of that twice, but I can do it again. And secondly, it doesn't even matter if the grounding is compelling. If I've got a deontological system, like the debate proposition concerns itself with having, you're saying that it's incoherent to have a non-theistic deontological system, and I've given you an account of a perfectly secular non-theistic deontological system, and now you're just interested in the grounding and saying, well, you could come up with a competing system. Well, that fine, but that doesn't say anything about the debate proposition. The debate proposition is about deontology in general, because you could come up with some other system which I don't find compelling, but you do. It's still a deontological system, and it's still not theistic.
Well, I think, I was expecting the principle of charity there, because when I made the proposition, I am sort of referring to the grounding issue, aren't I? I'm saying that you can only have deontology if you have a moral authority that says things are good and things are bad. If you're going to create your own system and then say, all right, I've created my own system, Immanuel Kant has created his own system,
Well,
and that's
my
deontology.
system, I've given you the grounding. If you don't find the grounding compelling, then there's not much more I can do. If you think
Okay, well,
that you
just
can
go
have,
through.
if
So
no,
just
no,
go through
wait,
the
this
grounding.
last point.
Yeah.
If you think you can have a universal law, an objective moral fact, which is self-contradictory, if you think you can have that, then your moral system is incoherent, and I don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about morality. It makes no sense to me. So I have offered you an account of how we can arrive at moral impermissibility based upon the fact it's impossible that it cannot possibly exist a self-contradictory objective moral fact. And you agree with that. So now that is the grounding. I don't know why you're now saying, oh, well, that ground is not good enough. You agree with the grounding. Like, what was the
No,
problem?
that's not. that's not really grounding, is it? Because I'm not saying I'm not saying
Of
that's
course, it's grounding. Of course, it's grounding. If it's impossible, right? Did you understand what I mean when I'm saying it's impossible for it to be the case? So then
well,
we've
it's
deduced a moral fact,
I agree that it's definitionally impossible, but I think that's a
right?
bit of circular. I think there's some circular reasoning going on here.
There's
I
no
think
circular reasoning. We've deduced it, and we've seen that it could not possibly universalize. Therefore, if we are talking about morality being a collection of facts that are universal laws of nature or act in accordance with some universal nature of morality, or even are like some universal law of nature, if such a thing were to even exist, right? We can even just be instrumental about the existence of morality. Maybe morality doesn't exist, but what we're referring to when we say morality, if it were to exist, it couldn't possibly exist in a self-contradictory way. Therefore, we can deduce some moral propositions as being morally permissible or impermissible. You agree with that? So now we've got a perfectly secular system for a deontic, rule-following based system. I don't know what else I can say. Like, I've presented you
yeah,
with a perfectly
I
functioning
understand your
system and you
point, but
haven't
I think
refuted it.
yeah, I understand your point, but I think the issue is you still have to accept these presuppositions. You have to accept these axioms. So, for example, I have to accept this plug-in model of Immanuel Kant's, right, which says you have to plug in the behavior and then deductively conclude whether it leads to whether it's self-contradictory or not. But I don't have to accept that plug-in model. I mean, that's a premise. That's everything we're discussing, right?
Well,
Whereas if it's a
you
model,
can reject logic if you want, but then we can't speak. We can't have a conversation because if you've
well,
rejected logic, you've rejected language.
I don't think it's not. I'm not sure if it's logic because we're talking about ontological truths here, aren't we? We're talking about whether there is a true moral objective code, and
No, I don't care. I don't care if there's if morality has an ontology or not. I don't care. I'm agnostic to all of that shit, and I don't need to care and especially not for the debate proposition. The debate proposition, your claim is that it's incoherent to have a deontic system which is not theistic, and I have given you a perfectly good account of how we can very robustly argue for moral propositions being morally impermissible in a perfectly secular way. And now you're saying, well, it's not good enough. Well, I don't care if you think it's not good enough at this point, because then the only way that you're going to reject it is by rejecting logic and saying, oh no, things can be self contradictory and it's fine, which is rejecting logic. And then we have to stop talking because you've rejected language and we can't have the conversation.
True. Okay, but Footsoldier, look, let me put it this way, right? I can create a system, like I said, which says everything that makes me happy is good, everything which makes me sad is bad. Now, I plug in the behaviors into my model, and if they come out as good, then it's a morally permissible behavior. If it comes out as bad, it's a morally impermissible behavior. And then I can say that's a universal law, like you've just created with Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. It's a universal law. It's a universalizable, I can say. And I don't see what the difference is. All right, that's the point. So yes, I've created a deontological model of ethics as well in a secular way. In that sense, there's no difference. It's all circular reasoning because you're starting with your premise. Sorry, you're starting with your conclusion.
No, look, is your system coherent? So if everyone was to follow your system, what? So everyone would have to know what is morally good based
No,
upon what you
no,
wanted,
because
or
no,
would
because
it be for themselves?
No, because I'm starting with a premise that what is good is that which makes me personally feel happy. So the same way that you're starting with the premise that which is good is something which is universalizable. They're just both starting. We're both starting with those axioms or those premises, right?
How does anyone else know what is morally good and what is morally bad?
Well, what in your worldview or in my worldview?
In your worldview?
Well, I'm basing it in spiritual philosophy or theism, aren't I? So I'm saying there's an objective. There is a moral authority. So that's how people would
No.
know.
If you're going to say what is morally good is your opinion or
Yeah.
what your dispositions or something, how does someone on the street, some random person, know what's morally good or not?
Because I'll teach them. I'll create a book and I'll spread it through the world like the Bible and tell them this is what makes me happy, this is what makes me sad. Now this is deontological ethics.
Right. So what you've just done there is you've created a religion, you've created divine commandment theory, right,
Yes,
and propagated it through the world, and that's not deontology. So now we can go back to deontology and see that I've provided you with a perfectly legitimate secular account of deontological system.
Yeah, but this is
And
exactly what you're doing with Immanuel Kant's
but
categorical imperative.
you've failed to demonstrate how my system is incoherent, right? The proposition isn't that you can come up with some random other way of asserting moral truths, which I don't find
Yeah,
compelling and no one else finds
it's
compelling. The
incoherent.
proposition is that it's incoherent.
Yeah, it's incoherent because it's got no grounding, it's got no foundation, right?
That
So,
doesn't make it
like
incoherent.
okay, or rather, your grounding is just purely subjective. So anybody can
It's
create.
not subjective. It's not subjective. It uses logic and deduction, and I've explained it to you, and you've understood it. Therefore, it's not incoherent.
Yeah,
For it to
okay,
be
yeah,
incoherent,
no,
it needs to either contain a contradiction, or it must be so unfathomable that you can't even understand what I'm saying, right? And so it contains neither a contradiction, nor is it unintelligible. You've understood it. It doesn't contain a contradiction. So there's nothing left for you to do than to concede the debate proposition.
Yeah, okay. I will actually. I won't concede the proposition, but I'll concede that last point I made. Yes. So sorry, it's not subjective. You're right. You've created an objective measure. Yeah, I accept that. But then so have I with my deontological proposition. But your position is that you would argue that both of them are deontology. Then is that your position,
No,
right? So
I'd say that your position there would be divine command theory,
which is
and it's not
deontology, right?
objective.
Which is deontology.
Yeah, but it's not really objective in a robust sense, because if you said, for example, you must you must remember the Sabbath, or to keep the Sabbath holy, or something like this, like, what does that even mean? Half the people who are Christians don't, or probably more than half, more than 50% don't even know what that means, and there's no way to test if that was actually really the words of God. How do we really know? How is it really objective? How do we get to the truth? We've got an epistemological problem. There's no way that we can logically deduce that. You could say, you can argue that because you can broaden the definition of deontology to be divine command theory. I don't care if you want to do that. You can do that all day long. The debate proposition was that a secular account of deontology is incoherent, and you failed to provide any reason for it to be incoherent. So at this point, either you just need to concede the debate proposition, which I think
Mhm.
you ought to, unless you can now pull something out of the hat, which actually would generate a persuasive argument to demonstrate the incoherence, or we need to go to votes, because it's starting to get a bit
Yeah,
circular now.
okay. I accept that. I think we are going around talking in circles a little bit. But what I will conclude with is, yes, I mean, by your definition of deontology, if it's just a measure that anybody could come up with, a set of rules that anybody can come up with and claim are true, then yes, I think a secularist or a non-theist can produce a logical ethics or an objective moral code. But I'm sure most moral philosophers don't think of it in that way. Um, but I would argue, yeah, that deontology can only be based in theism or spiritual philosophy. It requires a moral authority, and you are right. How do we know that moral authority is true or not? And that's a different question. I'm not arguing for a moral authority here. I'm not arguing that biblical theism or whatever is true. I'm just saying that I think that's the only way you can apply deontology. And also, just on a final point, I'll mention that, yeah, even deontologists like Immanuel Kant, as you know, he believed in an immortal soul. So I'm sure I can't be sure, but I think he's possibly relating to some kind of spiritual philosophy as well there, spiritual
Yeah.
ethics.
Well,
Yeah.
right. Did you want to say more? I guess that was a closing
No,
statement.
no, that's, yeah, I'm happy to leave it there.
Cool. Well, I'll give my closing statement. So, you mentioned quickly that Kant had some religious underpinnings. That's fine. He can have all the religious underpinnings he wants. Hegel can have all the religious underpinnings he wants. And everyone can have religious underpinnings. That's fine. But what the debate proposition is saying that a secular account of deontology is incoherent. I have demonstrated that if one wants to act morally, there is a system which I've demonstrated from the categorical imperative, the universalizability principle, where we can see not only just think, oh well, that makes sense or something. No, we can demonstrate the impossibility of certain moral propositions if they were to be applied as natural universal laws. So not only, oh yeah, this is a good idea. No, it's impossible that they could possibly be a moral fact in a natural way, right? So we can, from that, deduce some moral propositions. If we want to act morally, we can act in accordance with it, and that is the moral good, acting in accordance. That is a perfectly coherent, well-accepted understanding of morality. It doesn't require any theism whatsoever, and so it's a perfectly coherent account of deontology. And I don't feel like you've provided a persuasive argument for why that's incoherent. You've understood it, that it contains no contradiction. So definitionally, it's not incoherent, and you've not provided an account of why it is. So, right. So I guess that was my closing statement. I guess we'll put it to votes then, because there was no concession made.
Mhm.
And yeah, Stoney, you